For years, we thought Kody Brown struggled with plural marriage. But what if the key to unlocking all this rests in a much darker reality? Every fight, every apology, every mention of Coyote Pass, maybe it wasn't all a series of mistakes, but rather a subtle plan of control. But for now, we're taking it back to when Kody's whole playbook unraveled, where we see how Meri and Janelle were kept in a constant state of conflict through instilling fear and planting seeds of deception. This isn't just drama. This is manipulation in real time. Before we dive in further, I ask you in the comments, did you ever feel like Kody wanted his wives to remain splintered? To the world, Kody Brown has always appeared to be a man who was just overwhelmed, a husband trying to maintain 4 different women, 4 emotional realities, and 4 different sets of expectations. To the audience, he seemed at times forgetful, stressed, and overextended. But behind this image of chaos, there was something far more intentional happening. There was a pattern, a way of managing through separation as opposed to unity. And then that pattern became crystallized in the moment Coyote Pass became a point of contention for the family. To begin with, it appeared that the issues concerning the allocation of the land were normal. This family had been quarreling over boundaries, homes, and paperwork for years. So when Kody started venting frustration over delays, nobody blinked. Not until he made a slip. One small sentence to Janelle, and a small message from Meri. This completely changed the mood of the whole negotiation. To Janelle, he said, "Meri is holding up the deal." To Meri, he said, asterisk. Janelle might sell the land out from under you. 2 points, 2 charges, 2 women with wounds from long ago that never completely healed. Both of these were subtle enough to deceive in the moment, but toxic enough to sow seeds of doubt in just the spot where Kody needed. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was classic divide and control, of the sort that keeps people reliant on whoever it was that was feeding them information. For Meri, who had been pushed aside for so long, the realization that Janelle would betray her was like a direct attack on her greatest fear that she was irrelevant, ignored, and only one step from being silenced once again. To Janelle, who all her life had struggled for what was fair and for understanding of her finances, being accused of doing what Meri suspected she was doing without her knowledge went completely against her nature and her perceived position in her family. Kody wasn't just spouting off random comments. He was targeting the very insecurity that each of these women felt, making sure that they recognized each other as a potential threat, rather than viewing him as a common cause of conflict. To begin with, it seems as though the audience may think that Kody was merely overwhelmed, that he mixed up his words, that he was a very emotional person trying to explain things. But then came the paperwork, documents, timelines, legal communications. None of these were what Kody Brown had described to his wives. Suddenly, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. What is your opinion? He wasn't confused. He was caught. There was no paperwork for Coyote Pass that suggested Janelle was trying to make a sale without Meri's knowledge. They did not show Meri stopping the deal. Instead, it brought out that much simpler reality of a normal delay that occurs when a complex family tries to split a multi-acre lot. The problem wasn't the land. The problem was the story that Kody related concerning the property. A story that varied from person to person, depending on whom he was talking to. A story that gave him power. Because when 2 individuals are both frustrated, when you're frustrated, though believing that it itself is the reason, they don't communicate directly. They stop note comparing. They no longer question the story. They stop seeing each other clearly. Also, Kody is left as the only connecting bridge for them. That's when you stop being a husband, a partner, a brother, a father, a son. And begin to become a gatekeeper of truth. This slip, this point where the paperwork ran counter to what Kody said, was not merely a mistake. It was a flashlight on a system that he had been working with for years. Tell wife A one version, tell wife B another. Ensure that neither of the women completely trusts the other, and always remain in the middle, the only person who can understand all sides. It's a subtle yet potent tool of emotional manipulation, one that doesn't scream and yell, one that doesn't need threats or ultimatums, a type that merely rearranges information in order to maintain authority. Fans who were present when this occurred did not merely observe an error, a New York Times editorial noted. They watched as the blueprint for a long-term plan was laid bare in front of their eyes. Since the truth is not harmful, unless you're a politician who needs contradictory narratives in order to continue their reign. And that's what occurred in this case. The discrepancies that were being disclosed through paperwork were these. Kody was not attempting to bring his wives together on Coyote Pass. He was trying to keep them divided. Because as long as Meri and Janelle kept their distance from each other emotionally, and he remained in control of the story. When a man needs two different stories to stay in power, the truth becomes his enemy. While fans were watching a discussion between Sister Wives members over sizes, lines, and dollars, it would have been easy to assume that it was all about property. A few acres of land here, a line defining a boundary there. Beyond these overt arguments, however, a far more calculated and far more emotional dynamic was at play. Coyote Pass was for Meri a means of maintaining her connection to a family she felt was slowly expelling her. She had lived through all those years of being left out, of being shut out, of being a part of the division of the land, no matter how small her share, meant that she was still a part of something greater than herself. To Janelle, the earth meant stability and equality. She had invested so many years in this family. There was a lot of financial and emotional investment in this family. I wanted to know what. She needed logic. She wanted a plan that made sense. Their reasons were different, but no less valid. However, these are also the motivations that Kody exploited. Not inadvertently, but systematically. Because rather than working as a guide for this process, he guided the emotions. When the tensions were mounting, he offered Meri this subtle counsel. I think Janelle may be working this deal without you. And then a subtle hint to Janelle, Meri slowing everything down again. To a superficial reading, these seemed innocuous, even trephin. These were not casual remarks for women who were bearing a heavy weight of emotional scar tissue from decades of experience. Meri, who had struggled for so long with her own feelings of being unseen and unheard, now felt that she might be left behind. Janelle, who always struggled against being seen as difficult to please, heard that she was being labeled as a cause for the delay, yet again. These small drops of doubts were not mere words. These were strategic placements, emotional landmines in disguise, masquerading as updates. Rather than teaching them to see beyond themselves, Kody made certain that they kept their sights on each other, but not on him. Because in a home where the women were united, where they could compare notes, where there was communication, the weaknesses in Kody's leadership would be evident. There would emerge patterns, contradictions would be discovered, stories would fall apart. But when Meri believed that Janelle, too, might betray her, and Janelle suspected Meri of attempting to sabotage the whole proceedings, their attention turned internally to their own doubts. And Kody was still the bridge, the translator, the peacekeeper. The only person who seemed to understand both sides. This dynamic wasn't new. It was a structure that had been constructed over several decades, a structure of hierarchy which was not a structure of rules, but of subtle wedges. Kody in the center, square root, each wife isolated emotionally. Old wounds were slowly reopened when needed. Square root a lack of trust among the wives. This wasn't leadership. This was architecture, a careful design of a structure in which unity was impossible. Fans were always curious about how the women never seemed to support each other. Reasons for their long-held grudges. Why they never compared their stories until it was too late. The answer is simple. They weren't. Because if they ever came together, that they would realize that if they were to sit down and talk without Kody in the middle, that they would realize that every female lived with a different version of the same reality. Kody couldn't afford that. Thus, the Coyote Pass controversy proved to be the ideal arena for a classic move. Reignite old insecurities, create tension, position himself as the only solution. For Meri, it was all about relevance. These were matters of principle for Janelle. For Kody, this was about control, but, in a subtle way, by encouraging the notion that every woman was working against every other, he ensured that one factor would remain constant in his favor. They did not trust each other sufficiently to join together. Think of Meri and Janelle striking up a real partnership, discussing documents, analyzing conversation, sharing what he told each of them. There would be no lack of clarity. Just imagine how quickly discrepancies would come to light. Think of how powerful their presence would be as a united group. This was what Kody was afraid of. Thus, it became a perfect battlefield for this dispute over land. Not because of what sat on the soil, but for the feelings that lie hidden underneath it. Above all, it proved that in this moment, it was never about the land. The true aim was unity. The true aim, however, was division. Because a divided family is easy to control, easy to steer, and easy to blame, especially when it seems like they are all fighting each other rather than the puppeteer. But in this swirl of feelings, Kody was right where he wanted to be. At the center, the victim, the overwhelmed father, the misunderstood husband. But look back, and it becomes obvious that if unity ever occurred naturally, it threatened the entire structure he had built. This wasn't about Coyote Pass. This was all about power. A subtle, well-managed strength that relied on only one thing: to keep the women apart while remaining himself irreplaceable. A divided family is easier to lead, especially when everybody thinks they're fighting with each other. Word spread that Kody was embarking on what he has labeled an apology tour, and fans were hopeful. Perhaps for the first time in years, it appeared as if he were finally going to take ownership, true ownership, of the pain he had inflicted. The broken trust, yes, the growing distance that propelled Janelle further away from the marriage. People expected accountability. A moment of maturity. But what they received was something quite different. Kody spoke with Janelle in North Carolina, and his words were softer when he sat with her. He leaned forward. His words were measured and slow, as if he were lining up a deep profundity. He started with a supposed apology that seemed to be true. "Sorry for how angry I've been. I'm sorry for the bitterness. I'm sorry for the cruelty." For a split second, Janelle and the viewers held their breath. Was this finally it, then? Was Kody on the verge of realizing the harm that he'd been inflicting upon his family in the past few years? But then, with a movement so subtle it almost went unnoticed, he turned the whole conversation around. Because before Janelle could even respond, he switched gears. "It wasn't just me, you know. Remember how Meri treated you in the early years?" And just like that, the apology vanished. The emphasis was no longer on actions of this individual. But in relation to Meri's antecedents, this wasn't healing. This was a form of redirection. It was a psychological trick of the mind disguised as remorse. Rather than pursuing why he stopped showing up, why he was withholding his affection, why he allowed resentment to take over, why he pushed Janelle away until she finally left, and he pulled her backward into wounds she hadn't seen in decades. Those early years with Meri were painful for Janelle, that's true. There was jealousy, hurt, miscommunication, things she'd already processed, moved through, and left in the past. However, for Kody, those memories were far from history. They were tools, instruments for scar revisions, tools for building a culture of de-extat, to maintain Janelle as emotionally guarded and divided from Meri. Because if Janelle ever sat with Meri, truly times sat with her, and compared everything that Kody has confided in each of them. The story he'd spent all these years building would fall apart in mere minutes. So, rather than dealing with the problem, which was his own actions, he weaponized her old pain. Remember how you felt insecure with Meri? You remember how tough those early years were? Remember what she did? These weren't questions. These were emotional anchors that were pulling her backward, away from her own understanding and into the chaos of the past. The move was subtle, yet clear. Reopen the wound. Make her remember the pain. Distract her from the present. Make the division protecting him stronger. Because if Janelle were to emerge from her emotional fog, she would realize what was happening. He wasn't apologizing. He was reestablishing a dynamic that he relied upon for control. Kody has always known this one thing about his wives. If they're hurt, confused, isolated, or emotionally guarded, your words, they remain closer to him. If they heal, communicate, and grow stronger together, meaning in their relationship, they don't need him. And unity, true unity, was the only thing he never wanted. So, in what seemed like a tender apology, there was a profoundly cynical move. Bring her emotionally close, stir old wounds, establish vulnerability, rebuild dependency, encrypt distrust between her and Meri, while all along seeming like a loving, remorseful, and reflective person. This, in turn, is described in psychology as a form of covert manipulation. What I am trying to say, and what I hope you understand, I suppose I am trying to say, and this is where most viewers wouldn't immediately realize that, when Kody said, "I wish I shielded you from Meri as well," he wasn't comforting Janelle. He was rewriting history. He was putting himself forward as a hero who ought to have intervened, Cameron said. Even though, in reality, he often started a conflict or escalated it. He was pointing out that Meri was the problem. Not him. Not his choices. Not his favoritism. Not his emotional withdrawals. He used a narrative transition in this apology. This, of course, meant that instead of taking Janelle's own pain, he rewrapped it in a different package and delivered it back to her as proof that Meri was in fact not the man sitting in front of her, Not the man who pushed her away, but not the man who told the world that he no longer loved her. This explains just how quickly the apology fell apart when he opened his mouth. Rebuilding trust wasn't part of it. It was all about rebuilding control. Since, God forbid, Janelle and Meri ever teamed up, if they ever sat down and described what Kody Brown has related to them, would make it impossible to cover up the web of contradictions. And Kody knew that. So he did what he'd always done. He apologized, but in a way that would make it certain that change would never take place. Because true accountability brings healing, and healing brings about unity. And it's only this unity that has the potential to destroy all that he has accomplished. An apology that sends you back into old pain is never an apology to begin with. Consequently, by this point in the narrative, viewers were left wondering what question, if any, was being asked. How was it that a single individual was able to wield such emotional power over all these women for so long a period of time? The answer isn't mysterious, it's psychological. Because what Kody has been doing all along with the rise and fall of the Brown family wasn't random, opportunistic, or disorganized. It followed a pattern that experts immediately recognized. A pattern that hinges on three potent strategies of behavior. Triangulation is simple. You keep two people apart so you remain in between. Information flow remains under your control. You control the narrative. You control the interpretation of events. Kody perfected this. He told Meri one story. He told Janelle another. That was not what he told Christine. He left Robyn in her own bubble. Every wife thought she was being told the truth. But in all honesty, she was being told Kody's version of truth, a version of which was particularly tailored for her vulnerabilities. This explains why their wives seldom gathered. That was why they always felt like distant cousins. This, of course, is why old wounds never healed, because unity was never allowed to take root. United, we stand. A united front means a united. Shared clarity meant shared truth, and common truth meant that Kody lost control. This he couldn't risk. Vulnerability in order to relate, to heal, to be supported. This would apply to most people. Kody was vulnerable when it was to his advantage. Think about it. When he needed sympathy, he would cry. But when he asked for forgiveness, he toned down his words. To maintain distance when he wanted it, he shut down emotionally. When he needed influence, he projected that he was overwhelmed and misunderstood. His displays of emotion were not consistent. In fact, they were strategic. His fans also noticed when he was able to cry with Robyn in one scene, yet in others, then talk coldly to Janelle or Christine a few minutes later. Not because he felt differently, but for different reasons related to each emotional performance. Selective vulnerability has potency as it creates confusion. Why are diamonds so valuable when... Did he really mean that? Does he hurt? Hook. Should I feel bad for him? Secondly, in this confusion, accountability becomes lost. All members of the Brown family brought their own set of insecurity issues into this union. Christine worried about attractiveness and desirability. Janelle worried about finances. Meri was worried about being chosen, being included, and being valued. Kody did not ease those fears. He activated them. He told Christine that he wasn't attracted to her. He said that Janelle did not understand the finances of their family. He challenged Meri's loyalty at every turn. These were not isolated incidents. These were patterns, emotional landmarks that he regularly returned to. Because if the person in question has feelings of insecurity, these seek approval. They look for crystal clear explanations. So, who turns out to be this source of confirmation? When the individual that brought about this insecurity in the first place. This, in essence, constitutes the psychological loop of control. Everything cited above has a profound implication. The greatest challenge that Kody faced was when the wives started forming alliances. Imagine Meri and Janelle sharing notes, Christine and Janelle connecting tales. All three are faced with contradictions. The realization of the women that they were being fed different narratives. Old wounds healing as a result of understanding that cause of conflict. It would take one honest conversation between any two wives to dismantle decades of emotional structure. One moment of shared truth, that's all. There would be chaos, and all would... Kody understood this, talking about it. He knew that as long as the wives suspected each other of being in competition, then their timetables would never be comparable. Never compare detail. Never compare what he said in private. This wasn't fear of gossip. This wasn't fear of confrontation. This was fear of exposure. Because now that the storylines aligned, discrepancies would stand out like neon lights. And then, of course, the misunderstood husband story would fall. His constructed maze of emotion would fall apart. There would emerge contradictions. The patterns would be evident. Suddenly, he wouldn't be the victim. He would be the architect. And that was something he could never allow. So he went on doing only that which protected him, sowing controlled conflict, not explosive arguments, not loud fights, no dramatic showdown, but small seeds, quiet suggestions, old memories, subtle doubts. Enough to keep the women emotionally separate, but preferably not in there, but not so much as to make him look like the culprit. That is the psychology of manipulation. People who are afraid of unity will always make conflict. It's their only shield. Coyote Pass was meant to be a promise. Bisher, a dream woven amidst desert sand. A community where the Brown family would finally construct their dream homes, together as one. For years, Kody spoke of it with passion, with fire, with confidence. It was going to be the ultimate symbol of growth. Proof that, despite their wrangling, their fractures, their shifting allegiances, they were still one family. But rather, Coyote Pass marked a point when Coyote and Anatole finally reached their goal of being together. But it became the precise event that, when the sale of the land occurred, it wasn't a mere property exchange. It was the death certificate of a dream. The point when the last layer of illusion dropped away, and it became impossible to ignore the truth. Because with the sale came. The family hadn't been falling apart, as it seemed. It was all being dismantled, piece by piece. Through all those years of manipulation, wedges, and storytelling, fans were always asking, how did this happen? How did a family with so much promise disintegrate as completely as this one has? It was right there, in Coyote Pass, in the ruins, that we would find our answer. This earth did not divide them. It revealed a split that has always been present. Now, for the first time, the audience was able to witness how much Kody's impact had affected every breakup in their family, how every argument, every miscommunication, every fallen relationship was not random, but related. Because when the truth came to light, it quickly became apparent that Meri and Janelle were never adversaries. They were two women living under the same psychic structure, a system in which every wife was given a different story, a different explanation, a different truth. Two women, both of whom were conditioned to perceive each other as threats, when in reality, both of them were victims of the same pattern. Then, when the land was sold and the dust settled, something amazing occurred. Instead, it was something no one expected, not even Kody. The triangle fell apart. The emotional loop that kept them separated, a system of half-truths, of redirecting, of storytelling, finally broke. And when that control structure broke, everything fell apart. All the women got out of it. Individ, quiet, powerfully. For Meri, it meant understanding that her own loyalty, which she struggled to maintain, was not being met in return. That she wasn't the outsider Kody made her feel like, she was merely the most isolated. For Janelle, it meant being aware that her logic and fairness weren't the cause of conflict. They were the threat from which, because they brought clarity. And then, for Christine, who had already lived through the psychological maze, it was watching the others embark on that journey of awakening that she herself had taken a few years before. However, the most significant change was not internal. It was relational. Because for the first time in decades, y'all, all of our... Then, women began conversating with other women. Mediator. There. No interpretation. No filtered story through Kody. Real conversations as opposed... True. On a plain, parallel spring with a plain, parallel diamond. So, when individuals who were formerly divided now share information, what are the results? The puzzle pieces are now falling into place. The contradictions reveal themselves. The manipulation becomes apparent. The illusion becomes devoid of strength. This, of course, marked the end of the Brown Empire in earnest. Not the sale of the land, not the failed marriages, not the televised argument. This was a point where the women overcame the psychological walls that stood between them. Not physically, not financially, emotion. Because from that point, unity becomes a reality. Even in silence, even in fragments. Because of this, Kody wasn't merely losing wives. He was also losing the framework that protected his version of the truth. And that, in essence, is the balance of power. The women are no longer fighting among themselves. They are not vying for attention, affection, or approval. They're not taking in the tales he has been telling them. They're not relying on him for their own interpretation of feelings. They're standing together, even if only in understanding, even if only in terms of clarity, even if only for our mutual survival. This isn't a breakup of a family. This, in effect, represents their rebirth. They came out of those shadows step by step. They progressively regained their voice, one by one. They, one by one, then discovered they were never the problem. The unity that they pursued never actually existed. The dream of Coyote Pass was but a part of a story, and not theirs. There was no thunderous falling of the Brown Empire. It was a quiet happening, when the women stopped leaning on filtered truths and started leaning on each other. And in that moment, the illusion was broken. There was a change in the quest, and then came a shift in power. When truth finally becomes shared, then control finally disappears. If you found this analysis enlightening, share that in the comments. Did Kody purposely keep his wives separated, or did this family just happen to fall apart on their own? Your thoughts contribute to our next deep dive analysis. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss an episode analysis. Much love, and I will see you in the next video.